As an introduction to the Divine Comedy, I urge you to read the Wikipedia entry that will give you at least some basic historical parameters where to place it in the context of Italian history and in the context of what we are doing right now. I want to concentrate on two aspects. One, the language, and second, the cultural influence that Dante had on Italy and Italians. First, the language. At the time Dante wrote, which is the first part of the 14th century, the 1300s, the city of Florence was the most prosperous city in Italy because of historical contingencies, whatever. The Florentine merchants had accumulated tremendous wealth trading all over Europe, and the city of Florence was investing an enormous amount of resources into art and culture. In this city, a group of intellectuals were shaping the mentality and the culture of the elite. Dante was one of them, and they all communicated among them in the local language, which is Tuscan, which is Florentine. And here we need to clarify one thing. In the Roman Empire, the official language was Latin. Everything that had to do with official business, the laws, trade, religion, whatever, was in Latin. Latin becomes the official language of the Christian church from the very beginning because the church is based in Rome. When the Roman Empire of the West collapses and all the barbarians enter and the institutions are wiped out, the educated class keeps speaking and communicating in Latin. There are still communications. They're not as flourishing, but educated people, rich people, some merchants still communicate with one another across countries, across large areas of territories in Latin. At the local level, the people who always spoke the local languages do not have any access, do not have any need for Latin. The only Latin they hear is when they go to church, but they don't know what it means. They have no idea what they hear or what they're saying. In a way, there are similarities to some situations today in the world, but aside from that, so in the long period, centuries that go from the fall of the Roman Empire around the year 500 to the 1100, 1200s, in these 700 years, Latin remains the language of the educated people when they want to communicate officially across distance. Or it's the language of the court, the language of whatever institutions are left. But at the local level, the upper class, the lower class, they all speak the local languages. And these local languages keep shifting away from each other. Now we call them dialects, but in reality they are fully developed languages. So the Sicilian and the language of Venice, Venetian, for instance, are fully developed languages. What do I mean by fully developed? They are languages that are capable of expressing the entire range of human interactions. They are both able to communicate poetic concepts, mystical concepts, and concrete legal concepts, for instance. Not all languages can do that. If you take the language of a civilization that is only and exclusively agricultural and pastoral. They will not have the language for any form of technology, for instance, except for their own. If you were to take these small isolated areas who have no contact, no trade, no commerce with any other parts of Italy, for instance, their languages remain undeveloped, underdeveloped. They may have a much richer language as far as their personal and collective experience is concerned, but they are not able to communicate concepts that do not exist in their experience. Let me give another example. If we take the languages of the Inuit, the people who live above the Arctic Circle in Alaska and so forth, most likely they do not have the linguistic ability and the abstract concepts that pertain to interpersonal relationships among different ethnic groups in New York. They probably do not have the same range of language that allows them to discuss at a quote-unquote scientific level psychological description of individuals, characters, personality. They probably do not have a sophisticated language to talk about literary texts because their culture is an oral culture. But at the same time, they have an extremely sophisticated range of words that describe different kinds of snow. To us, there is snow and there is sleet and a little bit, and nothing much, nothing else. For them, there is a very wide variety of snow. And the words that they're using are very sophisticated because they include both, for instance, references to the past and forecast of the future. So they look at the weather, and the weather is of a certain kind, and there is a certain kind of snow that is falling, and they would use one word that tells you that this storm was coming from the north, it was very windy, it deposited snow, and it's going to be gone in 2 days. Now, with another word, that is still a word for snow, there is a whole series of information built in which is different, although they're still talking about snow. And so is for every language. Every word we use is dense in meaning and conceptual value. Latin was a fully developed conceptual, abstract, and concrete language, and so was Greek. Among the various Italian languages, the most developed, the best, was the language of Tuscany, and in particular, Florence. It has to do with money, it has to do with wealth, it has to do with power, but most of all, it has to do with the support that the society gives to a class of intellectuals. The language that dominates today is English, not simply because it is linguistically a useful language to have, but because in English certain concepts are developed before other languages or experiences develop them. So the entire range of psychological studies, for instance, is basically English language. Up until the 1920s, 30s, it was German that dominated, but when the German scholars in mass left Germany when Hitler took over, New York became the center of this intelligentsia, intelligent people, intellectuals, who produced a phenomenal amount of work in social studies in particular, and in social sciences in particular. And the entire vocabulary of the social sciences developed basically in English in America, the most contemporary one. This is to give you an example. And so with many other things. So Florentine is the best language of the time. Everybody recognizes it. People from different parts of Italy, people from Venice, which has a very highly sophisticated language, people from Sicily, same thing. They realize and they recognize that in reality, Florentine is the benchmark. It's also the coolest language. It gives you status. If you go anywhere in the world and you speak fluent English, it gives you status. Whoever in abroad is fluent in English has status vis-a-vis other people. It's the cool language to know. So even though other people speak the local languages from Milan, Bologna, Turin, Naples, Florentine is being regarded as the absolute best. And not coincidentally, between the end of the 1200s and the middle of the 1300s, it produces the three most important Italian writers ever. One of them is Boccaccio, and we just saw the Decameron. The second one is Dante, and the third one is Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca. And strangely enough, they kind of specialize in three different kinds of languages. Petrarch writes 100 short stories about common people, common experience. That is the language of reality. It has a psychological dimension, but it also represents reality the way it really is. Human character the way it is. Dante. Dante is the language of theoretical speculation, of the highest form of the intellect, of philosophy, of theology, of thinking about God and the moral, the eternal issues of what is life about, what am I doing here, what's going to happen to me. Petrarch, although he was a friar, is the inventor of the love poem. He is the inventor of the form of the sonnet, the sonetto, the 14 lines poem, and in the canzoniere, which means a collection of poems, he talks primarily about love. These are reflections about himself, but primarily the object is love. It is a psychological investigation in what happens to human emotions. Now, so you have, by pure coincidence, three great writers, phenomenally important writers, also good from the pure point of view of writing, that cover the three major areas of linguistic expression. Boccaccio, realism. Dante, philosophy and theology. And Petrarch, psychology and the sphere of intimate conversation with oneself. This is why this language, written for the rest of Italy, spoken for the Florentines, becomes the standard, the benchmark. And everybody else in Italy, in order to communicate, will slowly abandon Latin and will start communicating using the Tuscan. So now the Venetian and the Sicilian, when they meet, rather than using Latin, they both know, because if they are educated and they've been, people who travel around the world, because they belong to the elite, they know that they can talk to one another using Tuscan as the lingua franca, the mediator. This begins in the 1200s, becomes solidified in the early 1300s with these three major writers that become a sensation, that become extremely popular, and eventually this kernel, which is the Florentine language restricted to a small area of Italy, becomes the benchmark. Now, uneducated people, which are at this point about 99% of the population, speak the local languages. And the local languages shift and drift farther and farther away from one another. So if you go to Italy today and you sit at a cafe and you sit, particularly if you hear the older people, you will not recognize a word they're saying because they're speaking dialect, the dialect of the area. Now, the moment that they hear if you are at a cafe and the waiter goes up to them, he talks to them in Italian. He will take the order in Italian. But if the waiter knows them and they are from the place, from the area, he will ask them in dialect, if they are regulars. So the regular language, the day-to-day language for the longest time was always the local language that we call dialect. But it is a fully formed language. And for other interactions, more formal, official, where people want to show off, to look their best and sound their best, they don't want to sound like hicks, they speak Italian. Therefore, Italian remains as an official language, remains a language that is used primarily for stilted official communication. It is the written language because everybody who's educated can read it throughout Italy. Dialects are not written, basically, because there is this language, Italian. So Italian is very stilted. It's not as flexible, which is why, to this very day, an educated Italian can open the Divine Comedy and understand the language. This does not happen in English. Think about Beowulf. This does not happen in French, in German, in Russian, in Spanish, in any other language. The Italian of the 1200s, it is still comprehensible, easily comprehensible, that doesn't require translation, to an educated person today after 8-9 centuries. And that's because the official Italian language that's what it is official, is impervious to changes, doesn't change as rapidly as a spoken language. Meanwhile, as I said, the local spoken languages keep on changing. Now, the situation in the last 50 to 60 years has changed significantly, but keep in mind that up to my generation, up to the people of my generation, and you look at me, I'm old, yes, I know, but we all were raised bilingual. In my case, personally, I was trilingual because I spoke Italian, I spoke the dialect of my parents who moved from one part of Italy to another one, and then I spoke the language of the place where I grew up. So I spoke, when I went home to visit my grandmothers and all the relatives there, I would speak that dialect. If I went out with my friends in my town, in Como, I would speak their dialect. If I was in class, or if I was in a situation which required a little more sophistication, I would speak fluent Italian normally.